We are recording right now, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Nicholas Verzi. He is a lecturer at Stanford University. He's worked a lot over the past few years with recorded sound and the different profiles of the natural world that can map onto musical material in the concert hall. So I'm very excited to hear Nick's presentation and the way that it links up with language in our course. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Nicholas Verzi.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Andrew. And I see there's some clapping icons going on. I think Stuart, yeah, thanks a lot for that. I think as anyone who is a composer would say, there's a lot of different types of things that I do. I'm going to be focusing mostly today on something which I am toying around with, a term called natural rhythm, and then specifically something that I focused on in my dissertation called speech orchestration. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just to give basically an overview of the types of things that I do. I got into composing music mainly through acoustic instruments, and over the years have begun to incorporate lots of different types of electronic sounds into what I do. And specifically, I have what used to be, in a way, a parallel creative practice, which is field recording. And I started to record a lot of natural sound, so going out into the wilderness and capturing birds and the ocean and streams and all different kinds of sounds that you can find out in the wild, and then capturing them for their own sonic qualities, and at the same time, as a composer, basically taking those and figuring out how I can be creative with them and rearrange them in such a way that really gets at something different than just the recordings themselves. So with that overview, I guess then I can jump into more of the topic at hand, which is, again, speech orchestration and how that connects to the subject of language desemanticization, and in particular, how I've used that in several of my own pieces. So I'm just going to switch over to the screen share now so you can see a couple of slides that I prepared. Okay. So can everybody see the okay, everyone sees it. Okay, so basically then today, like I said, I'm discussing natural rhythm and speech orchestration. And basically what I mean by natural rhythm is rhythm that is not necessarily composed, but something which is occurring in the world. And so you can observe it, you can record it, you can analyze it, but it's not necessarily something that you can compose. That's the distinction I'm making there. And speech orchestration is focusing on speech, let's say, as one type of natural rhythm. So people are speaking, they're not necessarily focused on the precise nature of the rhythmic content of their speech and language, but it kind of unfolds how it does. And if you have a microphone, as I often do, you can take advantage of that and look through the contents and basically make something out of it in the same way that you could record a soundscape and observe what's happening in that soundscape and analyze that and make some music out of that. So basically then I'm going to be talking about three pieces. One I'm just going to touch on, which is E la tua veste è bianca for two voices. That's the first piece that I wrote under this umbrella of speech orchestration, where I started to experiment around with it for the first time. And then I'm going to go through briefly two more pieces, Lingualosa for vocal sextet, narration, and film, and then Chilnualna for two voices, natural sound, and chamber orchestra. So just to be more precise about what I mean when I say speech orchestration, speech orchestration refers to the practice of deriving musical material from patterns found in human speech, where I use text as a rhythmic framework. And these texts are often distributed in heterophonic geometrical patterns in a score, let's say, by which I aim to endow abstract materials with human characteristics that reflect both the phraseology and the semantic content of the text. Okay, so I also want to connect this to a larger conversation, since I know that I Am Sitting in a Room by Alvin Lucier is a seminal piece that deals with speech and deals with basically a similar sort of process. And I know also that it's something that you guys are going to be discussing in the course as well. So I just want to give my own take on that and provide an analysis which I think will work alongside an analysis that I can do of my own pieces to show how in some ways I'm continuing along a tradition, and in other ways I'm kind of making something new out of things that composers have discovered in the past. So I'm going to then switch over to this view.
Are both of you familiar with I Am Sitting in a Room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And how about, is everybody or just you, Stuart?
Actually, I'm not too familiar with it.
Okay, so
Okay.
this will be a little bit of an introduction then.
Okay.
So then this is if in case you haven't seen this type of screen before, this is something called a spectrogram, and it's basically a more detailed version of a waveform. And so what I'm looking at right now is a spectrogram view of I Am Sitting in a Room, a recording of the piece. And if you look down in this part, for example, or down here, you can see that this whole waveform covers the span of about 45 minutes. Now I can zoom really close in to a more granular view of the sound. And what you can see is that instead of a waveform that looks more like this, a spectrogram, instead of just having the events occur over a timeline, it also provides the frequency spectrum. So sounds that are down in this area, for example, are low frequency versus up here are in the higher frequency spectrum. And so when you're looking at an image like this, it gives you a complex waveform that you can use to analyze sound with quite a bit more detail and actually a lot faster. So what happens in this piece, and you can see this in fact, is that Alvin Lucier, who's the composer, recorded himself speaking a monologue. And then what happens is he plays that recording back into the room, and the feedback and the reverb that accumulate basically wash out the sounds of his speech to the point where the language becomes pretty much obliterated. And what you're left with is rhythmic material that is transformed into something which is more abstract and maybe even musical or pitched in a certain way. And what happens is he has his dialogue, or he has his monologue, and then there's a break in which there's an iteration where there's a small pause, and then the monologue repeats itself. So if you look over here, for example, you can see that there's like a large gap in between these two. What that means is from here to here is the first iteration, from here to here is the second iteration, from here to here is the third iteration. And basically, if you zoom all the way out, you can see how many iterations occur over the course of the whole piece. And you can just observe some graphical patterns that I think show you what's happening with the process. So just to kind of start at the very beginning, these shapes that you see, this is a very characteristic spectral shape of the voice, and specifically of spoken voice. So let me just play the very beginning of it so you can see kind of what it's starting at.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm.
Okay, so I'll stop it there. There's a couple of things that you can notice. First of all, just take note of the way that the speech actually looks in the spectrogram, and then just pay attention to what he's saying and also how he's saying it. So he's describing the process of what he's doing to his monologue after he's recorded it and then is projecting it into the space. And he goes on to describe how it's going to be transformed. But another really notable aspect of his performance of this is also that he has a stutter. So he has these naturally occurring rhythmic tics that become important as the piece goes on, because you can start to hear those patterns as they become divorced from the semantics of the language themselves. You know, after you're no longer able to understand what he's saying, you can still get a sense of the rhythm based on those verbal tics. And so if you were to, zoom all the way out and then jump to like the very end of the piece, let's say, the spectrogram looks quite different, but there are some things that are similar. So you can still see some of these formants here, these kind of ghostly shapes that in some ways really resemble the same rhythms as what's happening in the beginning of the piece. But if you look a little bit more closely, you can see that there are these horizontal bands over here and also over here. And what that means is that there's a consistent tone or multiple tones that are being extended as a kind of a drone, after a certain point in the degradation of the voice. So this is a very long process. It takes 45 minutes for it to completely unfold. And in fact, when he does perform the piece in person, as he does, and as I've had the privilege of seeing before, it'll unfold over very different time spans. It's all about the process as opposed to the amount of time that it's supposed to take. So you can see like general shapes, like the fact that this decreases over time and kind of fades into nothing, how there are no horizontal bands necessarily occurring over here, but they emerge around here and get stronger and stronger. So let's see, like, you've heard the very beginning, which is totally unaltered. Let's see how it sounds all the way at the end. Okay, so you can kind of sense, and actually I think seeing it helps too. You can sense that there is something rhythmic about about what's happening here that recalls speech, and in some ways it has a human element because of that. But it's been so thoroughly changed that you can't really tell what the language is. You can't tell at which point in the monologue he might be. But that's kind of the charm of the piece also, is that as you're listening to it and as the process unfolds, you get to know the speech really, really well. So it's kind of an interesting experiment that you could try, where you're listening through it and you say, can I pick out what's happening in this spot? Can I pick out what he's saying, even though I actually can't hear it anymore? There's a lot of psychoacoustic phenomena that occur in this piece because of the fact that you have so many chances to listen to it, while at the same time, every single listening is slightly different from the next. So I guess before I move on to the next part of my presentation, does anybody have any questions about any of this?
I have some quick points that I think would be worth going into real quick, just because they will likely come up several times over the duration of our course. Nick, you mentioned the term formants.
Yeah.
Is everyone familiar with this term? Yeah.
Not really.
Okay. Actually, Stuart, do you want to take a jab at a definition for formants?
Sure, I'll give a practical one.
Okay.
So when you're dealing with vowels, the way you are able to determine one vowel from another vowel, if you're singing, for example, everyone may be singing the same pitch, but maybe some people are doing ahs and some are doing oohs, and there's a recognizable difference in that. And by using the spectrograms, like Nick was showing, you're able to see what the difference is. And so, if you're trying to imitate it, or you're just kind of dealing with the way the vocal production goes, you have some formants which are essentially overtones. They go in parallel, or some go in contrary motion. depending on the way that you're producing your vowels within your mouth, and that's only for like human possible speeches or vowels production. But you know, there's tons that are like not human possible, of course. But yeah, that's I don't know. That's kind of a practical way of.
Yeah, that's a great summary. All of the different vowel sounds are really about the shape of our oral cavity. You know, we have the same. If you've ever seen a cross section of what our vocal folds look like, these two flaps, and they kind of move like this and vibrate very quickly to get the different pitches, but they're articulated by the oral cavity. And if you have these different shapes, those are the formant shapes. So in addition to being able to witness them on a spectrogram, you can point out, oh, this shape is this vowel. You can also look at a cross section of a mouth and see this shape is this vowel. It includes this tongue position and this mouth position. So a lot of the resonance that we get through speech, through song, anything involving the voice has to do with these oral spaces, these formant spaces. So I just wanted to point that out, because that's a term that will likely come up again and again in your readings and in discussions. So the other thing that Nick mentioned, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I had a question for Nick, but sorry.
Sure, yeah.
Before we moved on, no, I don't want to get in the way of Andrew.
The only other thing that I wanted to mention that Nick had alluded to is this sense of Alvin Lucier working with acoustical phenomena, right? So this is a piece that is, as it was stated, a cornerstone of 20th century composition. And one of the reasons why it's so substantial is it's a piece really about a room. The room is the instrument. You know, we heard one recording, but every recording, it's the featured instrument is the room. It's not necessarily Alvin Lucier. His voice is going to be very similar in every place. It's the space that's really going to transform how this piece is playing out over the course of whatever duration he chooses. And as Nick mentioned, the duration is indeterminate. So the sense of how long the piece plays out is going to substantially affect to what degree the speech is effectively desemanticized. If you go through 5 iterations, it can still easily be identifiable as its original speech. If you go through 40 iterations, it is going to be just those formant resonances that were present at the first iteration, but now, because they've been reinforced through the layers and layers of recording and the resonance of the space take over. So it is effectively desemanticizing that text over time. Mm-hmm. The last thing that I wanted to mention about Alvin Lucier is, yes, I Am Sitting in a Room is unique in that it is his take on this acoustical phenomenon, but his role as a composer in music history is all about acoustical phenomenon. He holds a very special place in that if you look through his catalog, it's like a what you can do with acoustical phenomena in the world. Fascinating works. This is the one that's most applicable to our course because, of course, it deals with language, but he has works where you're hooking up different medical devices to pick up electrical impulses in the brain, to then cue motors to hit different things. He has music along a wire. He has all kinds of really fascinating pieces. If you're interested at all in this type of music, he's certainly a name to know. But yeah, Stuart, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted some clarification on something Nick said. But yeah, Lucier is awesome. So Nick, you said that speech orchestration was not something that you necessarily compose, and I was wondering if you could expand on that. Was that you were saying it's like too irregular or idiomatic to speech, or I didn't know if you could expand on that train of thought.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I guess I was speaking more about the term that I'm, like, as I said, kind of toying around with, which is natural rhythm. So natural rhythm, I would say, is something, as opposed to being composed, it's something which is naturally occurring that you can then analyze for its inherent rhythmic properties, versus something which is composed can emulate that, but it's by its intentional nature, let's say, I would no longer categorize it as being natural sound or natural rhythm.
So are you like hit to the sequence Jew kind of stuff, the Annette van der Goorn, like hitting on metal surfaces as like a way of producing rhythms and things, as like some kind of like you have to perform into the rhythm itself? Is that kind of the route you're talking about?
No, I think this is really just an observational thing. So it's really like, it's more about observing things which are maybe not necessarily intended to be musical, and finding musical qualities or applying musical parameters on top of those things, as opposed to intentionally creating music which is intended to distance oneself from a more aware, let's say, practice, which I think is where you're going with that. And I think obviously the one of the key issues of this idea is when you are composing music, you are very much aware of things, and it's not really the same as just living out in the world. And so there's a challenge in a way, which is to, how do you come across as if something just effortlessly flows out of you as if it was improvisation? In a certain sort of sense, you're attempting to break down the characteristics of the real world, which give that natural quality, and then replicate that based on your understanding. And yeah, people do that to different effects, to different levels of success. And for some people, it's not a consideration at all. You can just compose something entirely abstract that's intentionally mechanical and non-imitative, and that's its own musical end also.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, that makes a perfect tie into your field recordings. I was just confused about it. Great.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and anytime you have a question, just let me know. Okay. So I think I should jump back in now. Going to share the screen once more. Can everybody see? Can everybody see that again? Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be discussing 3 of my pieces that deal with speech orchestration in some form. The first one is E la tua veste è bianca, which is based on a text from Salvatore Quasimodo's eponymous poem E la tua veste è bianca. And it's originally in Italian. I've given an English translation here just so you can see essentially what it's talking about. But I'm not going to go too much into depth in this piece, because this is basically just to say that this is the first piece which I started to think about incorporating the rhythm of speech into my music. So an example of how this might look in a score, for example. So this is like one of the pages of the score. And so what I've done is, instead of recording speech or having speech occurring in the performance, this basically just sets up a scenario in which I want all the syllables of the text to be represented, but I want to split them up between the 2 voices in such a way that if you combine them together, you can get maybe like a ghostly sense of all of the words. But because they're separated out and abstractified through extensions of different vowels and so forth, you're one step removed from what speech normally would be. And there are also pitch considerations once you start to elongate vowels and such. So this was basically the first experiment where I was thinking about this sort of thing. Otherwise, all of the work with text that I had done beforehand was really more in a traditional way, let's say, where I was thinking about text setting and how you can set text to rhythm in a very standard kind of song-like sense, perhaps. But yeah, I just want to mention that because just to show how far back this has gone for me. And then the next piece, which I really want to dig into a little bit more, is a piece I wrote called Lingualosa in 2018. And in this piece, I explored my own personal history by adapting text from the travel journals of John Verzi, who's my father, during a pilgrimage to our ancestral homeland of Lercara Fridi in Sicily. And he wrote this in 1986 as a journal, which I thought was really promising in terms of the story that he put forth. And in addition to that, I also adapted film from the personal collection of my great uncle, Leonardo di Bella, which was recorded during the years 1965 through 1987 in both Italy and the United States. So my goal with this then was to orchestrate my own recorded narration of the story. And I was seeking to basically create a musical halo that enveloped the recorded speech. And in doing so, add a third generation to my family's apparent continuing journey of artistic self-exploration through different types of media. So my great uncle was drawn to film, and that was the way that he was capturing what was going on around him. My father, writing his story down, kind of he transitions into literature in his own way. And then my added dimension is music, of course. So I'm just going to play kind of the introduction to this piece, just so you can hear a couple of the different elements that are present. And then we'll go through some excerpts of the score just to see a bit more specifically how language and desemanticizing language and the same sorts of things that we talked about with the Lucier are at play. Oh, start one down. Here we go.
Questa è l'Etna veduta da Passo Pisciaro.
On Friday, September 19th, 1986, during a trip to Sicily, I took a bus from Palermo to Leccara Fridi and spent the day there. As the bus service for this 1 hour, 4-minute ride is infrequent, I took the 6:45 a.m. bus and arrived at 8:30 a.m., armed with a photocopy of my father's baptismal certificate. My father was born in New York, but Grandma and Grandpa moved back to Leccara Fridi when he was an infant and returned again to New York about a year later. So this is how my father came to be baptized in Santa Maria ad Nives Church in Leccara Fridi. Of the piece. Can everyone still hear me okay? Okay, so that's just about the first 3 minutes of the piece. It's basically about 16 minutes long. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about what's going on in the piece and the types of concepts that are going on. So Lingualosa, the title, basically it's the same as it's a small town at the base of Sicily's Mount Etna, and it was formed at the divergent point of a volcanic lava stream in 1566, and also along with Lercarafridi, another place to which my family can claim ancestral lineage. So literally translated, lingua golosa means tongue, with lingua as the modern Italian word for tongue or language, and glossa as the ancient Sicilian word of the same meaning. So in a way, this town represents the meeting point of the new and the old, the past and the future. And that's part of what I'm thinking about when I'm composing this piece. And there's a lot of really interesting parts of the text once you get into it. So for example, throughout the text, there are several references to this mythical sense of time. It's implied that Lercarafridi was founded in the year 0, or perhaps 1 AD. So there's a similar mythic ethos that surrounds other aspects of my father's experience. And the different colors that you see here are going to highlight those elements. So the first thing is we have time here in the orange. And then, other notable aspects would be space. So all of the things in green refer to space. And then character. So everything in blue are character. And then the last element would be image. So these are 4 elements that I'm identifying in the text, and then I'm using these things as a means of beginning the process of speech orchestration. So over the course of the piece, each of these 4 dimensions of the text are articulated by the vocal sextet, and they punctuate the drone, which imitates the hum of the film. The pitch, language, and figuration are gradually associated with individual entities, where each dimension is given a harmony, and each time, space, character, and image a unique figuration. So for example, every time my great-grandfather, Antonino Verzi, is mentioned, the same heterophonic figures for his first and last names are used, along with the harmony used for all characters in the story. Here's just an excerpt of the score so you can see. And then in the 4 intervening movements to the main narrative, I set the names of locations that are seen in the film or otherwise are of personal significance. So those are Linguagolosa, Randazzo, Passo Pisciato, and Piedemonte Etneo. You can see this is the Passo Pisciato movement. And as the story unfolds, the patterns in the speech orchestration evolve from vague impressions, as you can see here, to clear geometric shapes that are informed by and informing these rhythmic frameworks. Then within these emergent shapes, vowels yield way to words. Additional sounds such as whispers and melodic fragments are added to the tapestry of sound. And a lot of this is really in service of representing a sense of awakening memory. So one of the reasons that I composed this piece, and one of the things that I was aiming towards, was essentially that this was a way to tap into my great uncle's memory. He is 96 at this point, and he has a lot of fragments of memory that are hard to really get him to remember. But I thought that it would be interesting to try an experiment where showing video that he had himself taken alongside a narrative which evokes a lot of the feelings of being in that country, plus some music to kind of help the process along, it might jog some of his memory a little bit. So that's really what this piece is about in some sort of sense. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the next piece?
I have a quick, I guess it's a comment, but I'm curious to see if you perceive this work the same way that I do. Your use of the vocal sextet is, you're desemanticizing the Italian and you're using that to carry the expressive, let's say, charge of the work. and then your narration is carrying the semantics of the work. So you're desemanticizing one language, you're breaking apart your setting of the Italian, you're allocating things to different voices, and you're able to divide that up and then still have the narrative and the semantic clarity in your narration, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can, if you're thinking of it, let's say we can think of it in the same terms as we would think of Alvin Lucier's I'm Sitting in a Room. What he's done is start with very intelligible text and then gradually degrade it to the point where you can no longer perceive what he's saying. And it works in his case because the story doesn't change. It's really the same thing that you experience losing sense of over time, and and gaining another sense. So what I'm trying to do is basically start at the very end of that process and say, well, what if I just took something that had the same rhythmic qualities and therefore the same expressive elements, because even just the way that we phrase things, the way that we tell stories are delivered in a pitched and rhythmic sort of way because we're trying to convey emotion or we're trying to really paint a picture. So even if you remove a lot of the linguistic details, let's say, a lot of that expressive force still remains. So what I was trying to do is basically, like I said, start at the very end where you have that as a kind of aura, and then combine that on top of the original language itself so that you can accentuate those expressive features of the narration while at the same time preserving the story. So you get a sense of the evolving story, but you also are able to, in this inner world or perhaps surrounding world, punctuate that and comment on it at the same time. So in a way, I'm responding to just the practicalities of the rhythm, but I'm also choosing with the different types of figuration to develop associations and play with those associations by growing the material over time, so that you get a sense of my own reaction to everything that's happening. And I think it's kind of like underlining things in various ways, or else bringing out the hidden emotion that wouldn't otherwise be there. Okay. Any other questions? Or should I move on to the next? Okay. So let me go back to the screen share. Okay, everyone sees that? Okay. So the next piece then that I'm going to talk about is Chilnawalna. I wrote this in 2019 for Ensemble Dal Niente, but I'm currently revising the piece and reworking it a bit. In any event, this piece essentially represents a musical unification of the essential forms of sound present in the natural world. So those are biophony, geophony, and anthropophony. And biophony basically means any sounds that are created by non-biological or created by biological non-human organisms, so animals. Geophony, which is non-biological natural sound that is basically anything created by the earth itself, so wind blowing through the trees, let's say, the sound of water. And anthropophony is anything that's caused or generated by humans. So speech certainly falls into that, but also things like airplanes and cars, any mechanical noise also falls into that category as well. So in this piece, I am giving a musical voice to each of these elements through the use of original field recordings that I captured in the wilderness of Northern California from 2017 to 2019. And these recordings come from 18 locations throughout the state. So the way that all of these recordings are represented, in addition to the chamber orchestra and two voices that are in the ensemble, is through what I call a natural sound instrument. It's an Ableton instrument, essentially, that I created specifically for the composition. It features over 20 species of birds, a water scale that spans from small droplets to epic waterfalls that are hundreds of feet tall, and more significantly in terms of this discussion, a monologue that was delivered by my brother, Adam Virzi. And he actually, he gave this when we were on a hike in Yosemite National Park at Chilnawalna Falls, on April 1st, 2018. So it's actually 2 years ago to the very date. So I'm just going to play a little bit of his monologue so you can get a sense of what it's like out of context. And then we'll move on to the other aspects of the instrument. Let me see if Ableton happens to be cooperating with me right now. There we go.
On Thursday night, I boarded a plane bound for the west coast of the continental United States for San Francisco. When I arrived, 6 hours of my life had passed. Counting for time difference, the clock read 3 hours later than my time of departure.
So that's basically a segment of his monologue that I used for the first iteration of this story, you might call it. It's not strictly a narrative in the same way that Lingualosa was, because it's not written. It was just pretty much delivered on the fly as a reflective exercise, or he was just reflecting out in the wild. So I then transcribed what he said, and then divided it up in terms of paragraph form based on the different aspects that I found in the language. And this is my brother, just so everyone can take a look at him. I think he took this picture of himself when he was in South America. Okay, so I'll get more into the language later on, but I'm just going to show you a little bit more of the sounds that are used in this piece. Can everybody hear that okay? Okay. Because it's a scale, you can play it like an instrument. Anyway, move on to the next one. So here are basically a more specific readout of the different locations and exact water sources that I used. Basically, you can see that they're recorded all over the place. So a lot of stuff in California, and actually one that's in Austria as well. And then here's just a couple of the locations that you can just kind of put some images to the sounds. So this creek here, I basically spent quite a bit of time walking through it and finding certain precise gradients of water that could be used to form the scale. So for example, this is the tiny waterfall. That one was in this, as well as this one. And then this one also. And there's several more. So this is one of the tiers of Chilnamana Falls. Here's some more. That's me. And then here's there's a recording at the very end of the piece. That's the estuary of Big Creek and the Pacific Ocean. So you can see over here, for example, this is the meeting place of the ocean and the creek. So here's the creek flowing into the ocean, and then here's the ocean, obviously. Here's another view of one of the recordings that I made at this spot. So kind of standing on this cliff over here, we have an ambisonic microphone, and this whole rock wall is kind of a resonant cavity that you can use to get a very focused sound while at the same time getting the ocean out here. Okay. And then, the most significant portion of this, at least in terms of quantity, is the birds. So there's just quite a lot of birds that are in this. So I'm just going to play a couple of them so you can see. So that's the Pacific wren bird, and that bird plays a pretty significant role in the piece. And I also have 8 separate recordings of the same one. So what it kind of serves in terms of the function is, as the piece goes in between different sections, it's kind of the glue that allows you to move between different worlds. The other birds are a bit more distinct from one another. So I'll play some of those as well. So there's obviously quite a lot of them, and they kind of flit in and out of the piece at different points, and they're one of the elements that, just as I said with the water, for example, are kind of fitted to the text that I introduced for my brother. So let's kind of move through that. Here's a more thorough readout, just once again, of the different locations and exact species of birds that I used. There's quite a lot of them for the birds. And then here's just some of the locations also. So for example, this bird, that's from this spot right here. And then the Pacific wren, which is the one with the multiple different options, was recorded in this location, although this is from a different day. The marsh wren comes down here. This is along the coastline. And then basically there's just many locations. So here are just a couple of them. Actually, this is a photo from Andrew. Andrew and I were in Yosemite National Park, and he took this photo when I made 2 of the recordings. Here's just a couple more. Yeah, you might have heard one that has like a buzzing wings. That was actually a hummingbird that flew directly in front of the microphone because I guess it saw something that it liked. Who's to say? Okay, so onto the text then. So those are basically all of the elements that make up the piece in terms of the natural sound instrument. But as I said, there's also a chamber orchestra alongside 2 voices. One was a soprano, the other is a mezzo-soprano. So if I divide each of these sections that have already been divided in terms of paragraph structure into different conceptual elements, then this is how I'm thinking of it. These are the distinctions that I'm making. And all of these, as they occur in performance, are part of the same natural sound instrument that then get played through the keyboardist. And what happens then, if we take a look at the score, is that in performance, the ensemble anthropomorphizes both musical and natural sound materials by blending sounds with the characteristics of his speech, using the transcribed text as a rhythmic framework for speech orchestration. So if you look down here, for example, here are all of the syllables for the text written out. And then on top of that are different geometrical patterns composed in a very similar way, at least at the beginning of the piece, to what was going on in Lingualosa. The difference, of course, being that this is a much larger ensemble. So there's a wider variety of different palettes that one can use, different sub-instrumentations that can be used in different areas. And so with this exponential increase in the complexity of the ensemble, there's a lot more opportunities for different types of orchestrating. And then, for example, one way that I'm using the natural sound instrument is that over the course of all of these sections that use the text, I'm orchestrating the text by taking the water scale and playing it along with the recording. So if it then covers the speech, what happens is that you get this very uncanny effect where it almost seems like the water is talking, because you take the sound, you take the natural rhythm of the speech and then cover it over with water sound. So in a similar sort of sense, or in a similar way to the Lucier, you get a sense of the human element through the rhythm and phrasing, but at the same time, you don't quite understand exactly what's happening. But because this is a straightforward narrative of sorts, I wanted to have both of them combined on top of each other, just as I did in Lingualosa. Now, this voice, the voice of the water, let's say, develops from whispering to speaking and finally to singing, as exemplified by the mezzo-soprano part here. And by beginning by articulating only vowels, which are Sprechgesang, half whispered, half sung, she gradually incorporates partial words, which are half spoken, half sung, and finally sings complete phrases with the soprano, all while increasing in dynamics, pitch variety, and complexity of figuration, as you can see here. And while progressing through the piece, I became less concerned with reacting to the semantics and phraseology and began orchestrating just more elaborate geometric patterns over larger phrases of the abstracted text. So here's one particular example. You can see a lot of symmetrical patterning here, like X patterns over here, or else like an entire three-dimensional object here as well. And then this adaptation allowed me to move past the limitations of sentence structure and focus instead on musicality, as well as broader forms of representation. So rather than abandoning the monologue altogether, these often symmetrical patterns are meant to represent images which are central to the piece, such as waterfalls. So if you look closely here, this line that starts at the bottom and kind of gradually moves up like this, which has kind of a central connection over here, that's meant to, at least graphically, represent a waterfall, with the understanding that perhaps the geometrical shape would have some intersection with the way that we perceive it. And then you can see, here's just an example of that waterfall from earlier, so you can see how the two might match on to one another. And then, now we can, I think, bring it back a little bit to the broader discussion and talking about I'm sitting in a room, and then the two pieces that I presented on as well. And what I'd like to do is, once again, switch over to the spectrogram view just for a second, so we can take a look at the commonalities between these recordings in a spectrogram. So even if the overall effects are very different, I think it's really interesting to observe things for their elements alone. So here's, I'm sitting in a room from Alvin Lucier, and you can, once again, see those vocal patterns. And then over here in Lingualosa, I can find the same types of vocal patterns here, but these are also separated out a little, or these are elaborated because there's a lot of other seemingly like noise happening in between. Things like these squiggly patterns are actually voices with vibrato. And then if I jump over to Walna, I can actually, instead of having to sift through the score and find exactly where certain locations would be, I can zoom in and find those vocal shapes, like over here. And not only is that just useful in terms of like being able to analyze a piece pretty quickly, but you can also see how something is playing out. You can see how the different sounds that you end up composing will cooperate within a piece. So like if I take this, for example, like something like this is a soprano singing over here. This is the Pacific wren, this shape here. And these are wind chimes that are over in the top. If I go further on in the piece, let's say, I can catch more vocal information like this. And then maybe before I switch it over to just, some questions and everything, I'll just play like one of those movements so you can get a sense of what it might sound like.
In 4 months' time, I will again set out for the West Coast. This time, I'll climb into a Jeep, slam the door, and settle in for a journey of 30 days, one way. When I arrive, 720 hours of my life will have passed. I'll crawl through time zones at a pace too slow to be effective. The juxtaposition of experience seems to underscore the very reason I'm taking both of these trips. To move, to live on the move, to move far and fast and far and slow. These differences are important.
Okay, so I think I'll switch back over to the camera view now. And I saw that, I think probably for the last example, it seemed like you were only hearing the audio through my microphone. Okay, well, in any event, I provided Andrew with the recording for this piece and the video for the other, and both of the scores that I was showing are also there as well. So, for sure, you can take a look at those recordings and listen to the entire pieces. But at least this will give you just a sense of what I was thinking about and a little bit of a thread to follow if you'd like to take a look more later. Yeah, so maybe this is a good time just to open it up for a bit of discussion.
Sure. I think I'm gonna stop the video here, and then we can have the discussion.
Sure.
So yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Nick. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.